The topic of this lecture is the distinction between presidentialism and parliamentarism, which are different ways in which the relationship between the executive and the legislative are organized within democracies. And I want to talk about this topic both theoretically first and then apply it to political systems in the US and Europe. First, I want to start with some preliminaries before I give a definition, then talk about prevalence of these different systems, which are more common and where, and then very briefly evaluate the question of which of these is better. Starting with the preliminaries, the topic here is one about regime types. So some democracies are presidential systems and some democracies are parliamentary systems. And the difference between presidentialism and parliamentarism is the way in which the executive and the legislative relate to each other. In the US, we're talking about the relationship between the president and Congress. In the UK, we will talk about the relationship between the Prime Minister and the Parliament. These are different ways of representative democracy, so both are democratic, but they differ in terms of delegation and accountability. This is an important distinction that many scholars have explored, and there's a wide variety of different classifications and typologies and definitions in the literature. Some of them are more descriptive, some of them are more analytical. I will take a fairly simple and straightforward approach, and I will not expose you to all wrinkles of this debate. So the easy part is to find some countries that are clearly presidential and some countries that are clearly parliamentary. So the easiest case for most of us of a presidential system is the US. And the easiest case is the UK as the best example or an excellent example of a parliamentary system. And virtually all scholars agree that the US is a presidential system and that the UK is a parliamentary system. The problem is that there's lots of hybrid cases or semi-presidential cases in Western Europe and elsewhere. For example, Austria has both a president and a chancellor or a prime minister. So does Finland, so does France, Iceland, Ireland, Portugal, Switzerland, Germany, and other countries. And it is more difficult to decide whether Austria is a presidential or parliamentary system than to classify the UK, for example. And we'll look at some of these borderline cases later. So let's turn to a definition. A famous definition for the presidential and parliamentary systems is looking at the way in which executive power is constituted. According to Sugar, in parliamentary systems, the executive power is subordinate to legislative assembly, and therefore we call them fused power or hierarchical power systems, and the UK is a good example of this. Presidential systems, however, have executive power that is itself elected in a separate election, separate from the authority of the assembly. So that's why we call them separate power systems or also transactional and bargaining systems. And the US is a good example. So I like to call presidential systems separated power systems, and I like to call parliamentary systems fused power systems. So here's a fused power system in a schematic view. You have voters that elect the legislator or the parliament, and then the parliament elects the executive branch. So this would be the UK, where voters elect the House of Commons, and the House of Commons gets together and elects the Prime Minister. Same in Germany. Voters elect the Bundestag, which is the parliament. Bundestag gets together right after the election. First order of business is to elect a chancellor. So voters elect and may choose not to re-elect members of the legislature. Members of the legislature elect and may dismiss the executive branch through a vote of censure or non-confidence vote. So in most parliamentary systems, the members of the legislature or the parliament can fire the executive branch. So they hire and fire the executive branch. Often, but not always, the executive branch can, in turn, dissolve the parliament and call for new election. In separation of power systems, which are here at the bottom, you have two separate elections. On the one hand, just as above, you have voters electing a legislator in the parliament. However, it's not the parliament that elects the executive branch, as in the system, the fused power systems, but it's the voters that in a separate election select the executive branch. Often these elections are on the same day, but these are still separate elections with separate ballots. So voters elect and may choose not to re-elect members of the legislature. Voters elect and may choose not to re-elect the executive branch. And the executive branch cannot dissolve the legislature, and in turn the legislature can not remove the executive branch under normal circumstances. So there is very rare and specific ways in which the legislator can fire the executive. We can express this a little more theoretically, again using Matthew Schuckart's definition, who says the defining characteristic of parliamentary and presidential democracy speak first to the question of the origin and survival of executive and legislative authority, where in a pure parliamentary democracy the following two basic features are in place. First, the executive authority consisting of a prime minister and cabinet arises out of the legislative assembly. Second, the executive is at all times subject to potential dismissal via a vote of no confidence by a majority of the legislative assembly. And then presidential democracy is defined by the following three basic features. First, the executive is headed by a popularly elected president who serves as the chief executive. Second, the terms of the chief executive and the legislative assembly are fixed and not subject to mutual confidence. So the parliament doesn't hire or fire the president, and the president cannot dissolve the parliament. And third, the president names and directs the cabinet and has some constitutionally granted lawmaking authority. Let's look at a political system to decide whether it's a parliamentary or a presidential system. First, which country is this? Well, I hope you found the correct answer. This is the United Kingdom. Probably the Queen gave it away. So in the UK system, we have people here, they do one thing. They elect the House of Commons. They do this roughly every 5 years. The first order of business in the House of Commons after the election is they get together and they select or elect a prime minister. Often this is fairly easy because the House of Commons typically has a parliament or a distribution of seats in which one party has a majority and the prime minister is elected with majority vote. So typically the party that has a majority elects a prime minister and we're done. Sometimes it's more complicated. If no party has a majority in the House of Commons, then they will need to have some sort of coalition with another party. That happens, but it's fairly uncommon in the UK system. It's extremely common in other parliamentary systems, including Germany, Austria, Sweden, and other systems. Note that the Prime Minister can fire the House of Commons, and in fact has to dissolve the House of Commons at least within every 5 years. So there is no fixed election schedule, unlike in the US, where we have elections every 4 years in the second Tuesday of November. We call these elections endogenous elections in the UK because the Prime Minister gets to decide when the new election is going to be. However, the Prime Minister has to schedule these elections at the latest 5 years after the last election. And Prime Ministers are pragmatic about when they schedule these elections. They try to put them at times, or they try to hold these elections during a time in which their government is pretty favorably seen in polls and during good times, so that they win re-election. And that often works, and sometimes it does not. Note also that the House of Commons or the Parliament at any point in time can simply elect a different prime minister and therefore fire the existing prime ministers. And this is something that happens. So sometimes prime ministers resign, and then the parliament elects someone else. This happened recently with David Cameron and Theresa May after the Brexit vote. Sometimes the prime minister becomes very unpopular and is forced out. Sometimes the person wants to retire. So there are all sorts of scenarios in which the prime minister changes. In other systems, the prime minister may change because the supporting coalition may change. So there are instances in which the executive changes even though there is no new election. And that's perfectly fine, legal, and normal in parliamentary systems. So looking at this definition that we just had up there, a pure parliamentary democracy is defined by the following two basic features. If you go through these features, the executive authority arises out of the legislative assembly, that's correct. And then secondly, the executive is at all times subject to potential dismissal. That's also true. So the parliament hires and fires the executive. This is a parliamentary system. Let's look at a different political system. Why don't you have a look at this and guess which country it is? Well, I hope you figured out this is the United States government system with a clear attempt of three separate powers: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, here represented by the Supreme Court. And this is a very good example of a presidential system. So the defining feature, we said, is a separation of power in terms of having separate elections for the parliament and the president, which clearly is the case in the system. So citizens have a vote for members of the House, one chamber of the parliament, members of the Senate, the other chamber of Congress, and then the president via the Electoral College, which is this sort of interesting wrinkle. And these are separate elections. They happen at the same day, but on different ballots. And so the president gets his or her job independently from the legislature. And the legislator cannot typically fire the president unless there is some serious wrongdoing. And the president cannot dissolve Congress under any circumstances. So just looking at the definitions we had up there, the US system fits these very well. So this is a presidential system because the executive is headed by a popularly elected president who serves as the chief executive. This is correct. Second, the terms of the chief executive and the legislative assembly are fixed and not subject to motion confidence. This is correct as well. And then third, the president names and directs the cabinet and has some constitutionally granted lawmaking authority, which is also correct. The problem is countries that fall somewhere in the middle. Not all systems fit this nice dichotomy of presidential versus parliamentary system. In fact, many don't. The most common hybrid system is called semi-presidential, which a famous political scientist, Duverger, defines in the following way. First, a president who is popularly elected. Second, the president has considerable constitutional authority. And third, there exists also a prime minister and a cabinet subject to the confidence of the assembly majority. So here you have it. We've seen parliamentary systems that have prime ministers or chancellors. We've seen presidential systems that have presidents, but not prime ministers. And these hybrid systems have both a president and a prime minister. It turns out many countries have both a president and a prime minister, many countries in Western Europe, but in most cases the president is fairly weak, and therefore we call these countries parliamentary systems. For example, if you look at the German system, there is actually a president, but the president has largely ceremonial powers, and the real focus of power is the prime minister, and therefore we call the system a parliamentary system. The prime minister in the German system is called chancellor, but it's the same thing. So let's look at this system, this political system, which is a real political system. Why don't you have a look and guess which country this is? Well, this is France. So the French political system works in the following way. We have, again, citizens down here, and the citizens elect directly every 5 years a president, and they also elect directly every 5 years a National Assembly. In the past, the term of the president used to be 7 years, and the National Assembly was 5 years. They are now synchronized. Now, if you look at this system, the president actually also appoints a prime minister who's up here. And that prime minister is responsible and subject to a no confidence vote to the parliament. So the prime minister is in the position of having two masters. One, the president, and the other master is the parliament. So this is a bit of a hot seat, which can be a fairly uncomfortable position to have. And it can be uncomfortable because you are in one of two scenarios. Either the president's party has a majority in the National Assembly, in which case the prime minister's election is pretty straightforward because the president suggests someone from his party as prime minister, and the National Assembly is going to be happy to not fire this person. But in this case, if the president and the prime minister are from the same party, because the National Assembly is of the same party of the president, the role of the prime minister in this political system is not particularly powerful. In fact, in this case, the president is basically in charge of most important decisions and is doing both domestic policy and foreign policy. Now, the other scenario is where the president is from a different party than the majority in the National Assembly or the parliament. This scenario is called cohabitation in French, and so you need the president and the National Assembly to somehow work out a compromise to find a person as the prime minister that is suitable to both of them, and that can be pretty awkward. Now, if this is the scenario, then the prime minister is actually quite powerful, because customarily what happened in this scenario is that the president concentrates on foreign policy and the prime minister concentrates on domestic policy, though that's more of a norm than a rule. Let's delve a little deeper into this political system using the presidential elections of 2012 as an example. So the presidential election in France is not actually one election, it is two elections that are following each other closely within a 2-week window. So if you look at the bottom of the slide, you see that the first election was on April 21st, and the second election was on early May 5th and 6th. Why do you have two separate elections, you may wonder? Well, so here's how it works. In the first election, the ballot has lots of names on it, and people can choose whomever they want to. And in 2012, here are the results. François Hollande, who was the nominee of the big party of the left, the Parti Socialiste, which is a social democratic party, got 28.6% of the vote, and the candidate of the Conservative Party, Nicolas Sarkozy, won 27% of the vote. However, you see that other candidates won significant vote shares. So the third candidate, Marine Le Pen, close to 18%, and then others 11%, and some not so much. So you could say, in principle, we're done here, and we have a president, François Hollande, and we move on. But that's not what the French do. So unless one of these candidates has 50% or more, has a majority of the vote, there will be a second round. And in the second round, what they do is they pick the first two people, the top two vote getters, in this case François Hollande and Nicolas Sarkozy. And so 2 weeks later, you have a ballot with these two people, and you're supposed to choose one of them. And this is how it came out in 2012 in the second round, with François Hollande winning the election with roughly 52% to 48%. Why would you want to do this? Well, there's a variety of reasons, but one main reason, I believe, is that this way you're guaranteed to have a majority for the new president. So François Hollande can claim 50% of the population supported his presidency, which, if you look at the previous slide, doesn't look so great because he only had 28% of the first round. François was a very unpopular president, and he decided not to even try to run for re-election. And so the 2017 election was wide open. You see here the first round result of that election, and you can see that Emmanuel Macron, the person here in the top left, who is 39 years old at the time, wins the election with 23.7%. And second comes Marine Le Pen. She is from Front National, a radical right-wing nationalist party. And then third and fourth are two politicians and their parties, Mélenchon and Fillon, and then you see some of the other results. So according to the electoral system in France, as you already know, that means the top two vote getters have a runoff. So the election was April 23, and then the runoff is a couple weeks later on May 7, 2017. So then French voters have a choice between Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen. Macron easily won the second round of that election. He beat Le Pen with 66 to 33 or so percentage points. The left shows you where he would win most of the votes, and where Le Pen would be stronger. For a while now, the French constitution has it that there will be parliamentary elections for the legislative body after the French election for the president. So in June 11 and 18, in a two-round system, the French National Assembly, the French Parliament, one chamber of it, had its election. And here are the results. La République En Marche, which is the movement or party founded by Macron, the president, won an overwhelming majority with 361 out of 577 seats. The previous party with the majority, the Socialist Party, was pummeled and was left with 46 seats, and the Conservative Party was left with also only a very small seat share. Now, this is a two-round system which works comparable to the two-round system in the presidential election. So there's 570 seats, and for every seat there is a separate election happening on June 11 in this particular case. And then after the first round, we will know that candidates for that seat will have a certain percentage. And so we will know who has the most votes. And if nobody wins an outright majority, there will be a second round. And in the second round, everybody qualifies that has at least 12.5% of the eligible vote. So the second round is among more than two candidates, although sometimes it can happen that only one candidate has more than 12.5% of the vote, in which case there will be a second candidate with the second most votes advancing to the second round. Just to show you how extraordinary the election result from 2017 was, here are the assembly election results since 1981. You see the two big parties are essentially the PS, the Socialist Party, which is a Social Democratic Party, and then the conservative parties. There is two of them at the beginning. At some point they essentially merge. And you have either the conservatives being very powerful, or basically the left being pretty large and the right being pretty large. And that surely was true in June 2002, where the conservatives had a majority. Then in June 2007, that was true as well. And in June 2012, in the previous parliament, you had the Parti Socialiste, the party of the president, François Hollande, had a majority, a comfortable majority, with about 300 seats to 200 seats. And that completely changed, so the traditional parties pretty much got wiped out, especially the Socialist Party, which again is a Social Democratic Party, and that new movement won 361 seats. The executive in France in 2017 consists of the president, Emmanuel Macron, who won the presidential election, as well as the prime minister, who is appointed by the president, which is the gentleman here on the right, Edouard Philippe. Edouard Philippe also has to have the support of the parliament, which is very easy in this particular case because Macron has a vast majority of the seats in the parliament and Edouard Philippe is from his party, so there is no cohabitation necessary. In 2020, Macron decided to replace the prime minister and it is now someone else. If you want the most recent personnel, you should check out Wikipedia or some such source. If we take the definition of semi or semi-presidentialism used above and apply it to the French case, we find that first, a president who is popularly elected is indeed the case. Second, the president has considerable constitutional authority. He has, so that's a check. And third, there exists also prime minister and cabinet subject to the confidence of the assembly majority, which is the case in the French system. So the French system is a good example of a semi-presidential or hybrid system. There are more complicated or problematic cases when it comes to classifying them as presidential or parliamentary. Switzerland is anyways a fairly complicated or different system from what we are used to typically, and so some people would classify Switzerland as a presidential system, but remember the Swiss system has the magic formula and this collective executive, so there's lots of things that are different about this political system. Other problematic cases are Ireland, Iceland, and Finland, which some authors would call parliamentary systems, others would call them mixed or semi-presidential. And then other mixed systems are Austria, Finland, France, Iceland, and Portugal. Here tastes differ or definitions differ. I would put Austria as a parliamentary system, for example. Just like Germany, both of them have presidents and both of them have parliaments, but it's undoubtedly true that the Austrian president has much more political influence compared to the president in Germany, so that's why some scholars would be fine calling Austria a mixed system. Let's look at the prevalence of these systems. How common are they? If you just look at a map and look at where presidential systems exist and look at where parliamentary systems exist, it looks a little bit like geography is destiny in the sense that most of Western Europe, including the Mediterranean countries, are parliamentary systems, and many former British colonies are parliamentary systems. However, if you look at Eastern Europe and some Western European countries, you'll find semi-presidential systems, but there aren't really clear-cut presidential systems in Western Europe. This is different in the Americas. Both in North and South America, we find good examples of presidential systems. So there's a big divide where in America and both Latin America and North America, you have presidential systems. Many countries are presidential systems, while in Europe, many countries are parliamentary systems, or at least only semi-presidential systems, while in the rest of the world there really are no clear patterns. Here's another way of looking at the geography is destiny claim. This breaks down parliamentary, presidential, and mixed democracies, as well as dictatorships in absolute numbers for the year 2000 in Latin America, Eastern Europe, and former Soviet Union, as well as Western Europe. And you see here in the first panel of this figure that the democracies in Latin America are presidential democracies, while the democracies in Western Europe, here on the very right, tend to be parliamentary democracies. In terms of numbers over time, here's a figure, again, showing the absolute number of dictatorships, which is the top line, and then the absolute number of mixed democracies, parliamentary democracies, and presidential democracies. And you see dictatorships have been in decline, so going from 110 to about 80 countries around the world, while democracies have increased and are now, a majority of countries are now democratic. What you can't quite see here, given that these are absolute numbers, but the patterns look like the following. Parliamentary systems are about 50% of democracies, while presidential and mixed systems are about 25% each, which is a big increase for mixed systems, because mixed systems used to be very uncommon until essentially Eastern Europe democratized. Let's finally turn to the question of which of these systems, government types, is better. Are presidential systems better than parliamentary systems? So this would be a great essay question. Are parliamentary systems conducive to better political outcomes than presidential systems? Why or why not? Now, as with most essay questions, there is no right or wrong answer. There's just good or less convincing arguments on one side or the other. And so I will not give you a straightforward answer to this pretty straightforward question, because there is no straightforward question. The question can be approached from many, many different angles. You could, for example, ask in terms of, well, which political outcomes are we talking about here? For example, are we talking about democratic stability? Are we talking about policies? Are we talking about growth? Are we talking about good governance and corruption? Or are we talking about clientelism? And all of these questions have been hotly debated theoretically and empirically in the literature. I just want to take the first example to show you that even if we narrow down the question to, are parliamentary systems better in terms of democratic stability than presidential systems, the answer isn't so straightforward. The first thing you have to do is you have to classify countries in terms of whether they're democracies, and then you have to classify democracies into parliamentary systems, presidential systems, and mixed or semi-presidential or hybrid systems. And people have done this, and then they have looked at the survival of these different systems in terms of whether they remain democratic or not. And if you do this and you look at the 85 nations that are democratic regimes over this time period, and you count the number of breakdowns that occur in this time period, and you will find that 19 out of 1,425 parliamentary regime years will die. So these are cases where parliamentary systems become undemocratic. However, over the same time period, 31 presidential regime years die, so there are only 849 of them, so that's a much higher percentage. So we see that 1.3% of parliamentary regimes die, or regime years die, while that percentage is almost 3 times as high for presidential systems. And so the literature, the scholarly literature, doesn't debate that presidential regimes are less stable, but it disagrees on the reason why it is that they're less stable. And some people argue that there is something about presidentialism itself that is bad, so that it's presidentialism per se that makes these systems die more often, while other people say, no, the reason we see these numbers, we see these patterns in the data, is that presidential systems happen to be in places or in countries where democracy has a harder time surviving. The theoretical arguments against presidentialism can be summarized as follows. There's a famous article called "The Perils of Presidentialism." And here are the kinds of arguments that people make against presidentialism and in favor of parliamentarism on the flip side. First, the executive and legislature have competing claims to legitimacy, which is undoubtedly true, because there's 2 separate elections, and in one election, voters elect an executive, and in another election, they vote for the parliament. And it's very possible that these elections lead to different parties in power of the executive and the legislator. In fact, this is the normal case in the US. In the US, historically speaking, it's fairly rare that the president is from the same party as the majority party in Congress. There's a further complication, of course, that there's two chambers, the House and the Senate, and so it's very rare that both chambers of Congress and the presidency are run by the same party. It happens, but it's not very common. Now, that means that after every election, both bodies can claim that they are representing the people, that they have a mandate for the kinds of policies that they promised during the campaigns. And they both have a good point, but it's in competition with each other. And so that can lead to a decline in trust and legitimacy in these systems. At least that's what people argue. Secondly, many governments, for one reason or another, at some point experience some sort of crisis. There might be clashing leadership styles, there might be factions within parties and things like this. And in parliamentary systems, it's possible to resolve these crises simply by calling for a new election or by electing a new executive. Remember that in parliamentary systems, the parliament simply can fire and replace the current executive at any point in time. Now, in presidential systems, that's not possible. And you often get gridlock, or if you have the executive being in crisis, that becomes really a crisis for the entire regime. The third argument against presidentialism is that presidentialism is following a winner-takes-all logic, in the sense that there can only be one winner, and the election losers are not represented in the executive. That is quite different, at least potentially, in parliamentary systems, because in parliamentary systems it is often coalitions that elect the executive, the prime minister, and therefore the election losers are often very much represented in the executive. Presidential systems also very much personalize the choice between the top two candidates, or between the top candidates in the election campaign, and therefore these campaigns are very much focused on personalities. This is quite different typically in parliamentary systems, because the election is not about people but about parties and hopefully policies, because the parliament is the one that elects the prime minister, it's not the people. And so in many cases, voters actually were never asked whether they wanted to have person X or Y as prime minister or as chancellor. Often they know in advance which person would be elected as prime minister or chancellor. So typically in a parliamentary system there's an election, and typically the parties would say, okay, if we win the election, or if we win a majority in the parliament, we're going to elect this person as chancellor. But remember that this person can change during a legislative period without the parliament having to be re-elected. And so quite possibly people had no idea who might be the president, the prime minister down the road. Some people also say that presidential systems encourage populist candidates, which historically have a difficult record. But there are people that say, look, presidential systems are actually better than parliamentary systems, theoretically, because it's easier to identify who is doing what, because you don't have this fusion of the legislative and the executive branch as a parliamentary system. You clearly have an executive, you clearly have a legislator, and so it's easier to identify who is responsible, for better or worse, for certain policies. That leads, these people argue, to better accountability, because in many ways the way we hold politicians accountable is after the fact. So we elect people, either members of parliament or members of the executive, and if they don't perform the way we think they should, we can decide not to re-elect them. That's the accountability mechanisms in most representative democracies. And people that like presidential systems or that come up with arguments in favor of them point out that that type of accountability is easier in presidential systems. They also point out that you have these mutual checks and balances, just like in the American Constitution. And they finally say, really, presidential systems are so different from each other that you cannot possibly make general claims about what presidential systems are and why they should be better or worse theoretically. So if we come back to this question of whether they are better, even if we boil it down to a very specific meaning of better in the sense of saying which of them is more stable. So is the stability in parliamentary systems higher or in presidential systems? As I've said, the data are pretty clear on this, 1.3% versus 3.6%, so suggesting that parliamentary systems are much more stable than presidential systems. But the interpretation of these facts is more contested. And some people argue that what kills presidential systems or democracies is not presidentialism, but rather the military legacy. Remember that we've seen that most presidential systems exist in Latin America. Well, many systems in Latin America emerged out of military dictatorships. And so the argument of that people make here, scholars make here, is that it is not the case that that presidentialism is to blame for the decline of democracy. The decline of democracy is caused by the unstable conditions and the military history in these countries. So the problem of presidential democracies, one of these scholars says, is that they tend to exist in societies where democracies of any type are likely to be unstable. So in conclusion, parliamentary versus presidential systems is a distinction in terms of how the executive-legislative relations are organized in different countries. There is two ways in which you could organize them: fused power systems or separated power systems. And when it comes to which is better, it's a tough question that does not have a very clear answer. I believe this particular figure really is an excellent summary of presidential systems at the bottom and parliamentary systems at the top. So the fused power systems or parliamentary systems are systems in which voters elect parliaments and parliaments elect the executive branch, and the separation of power systems or presidential systems at the bottom are systems in which voters elect the legislator in one election and the executive branch in a separate election.